Jake Morrison sat in the back row of the combat tactics classroom and tried not to fall asleep. The instructor droned on about standard fleet formations, while Jake stared out the window at the training ships moving across the sky. Everyone else took notes, but Jake just watched the ships and wondered why they always flew in the same patterns. The Terran Naval Academy was supposed to be the best military school in human space, but Jake felt like he did not belong there. His test scores were average and his physical training marks were worse. Other cadets seemed to understand everything the first time, while Jake had to think about problems in his own way. The instructors did not like his way of thinking. Jake came from a small farming colony where people had to fix things with whatever they could find. When the harvester broke down, you did not wait for proper parts. You used what was available and made it work. The academy taught that there was a right way to do everything, but Jake knew that sometimes the right way did not work. 3 years had passed since humans made first contact with the Zephyrian Empire. The aliens were big and scary looking, but they said they wanted peace. They had scales like snakes and claws like wild animals. Most humans were afraid of them, but the government said they were friends now. Jake thought they looked like the predators from old Earth stories. Commander Vextar was the first Zephyrian that most cadets had ever seen in person. He stood almost 8 feet tall, and his yellow eyes seemed to see everything. When he walked through the academy halls, everyone moved out of his way. His claws clicked on the metal floors, and his voice sounded like rocks grinding together. The other cadets whispered that he had killed hundreds of enemies in battle. The cultural exchange program was supposed to help humans and Zephyrians understand each other better. Vextar would observe human military training and report back to his empire. Jake wondered what the alien really thought about human soldiers. Humans were small and weak compared to Zephyrians. They had no claws or scales or natural weapons. All they had were their brains. During the morning briefing, Admiral Harris explained the training exercise. A group of terrorists had taken hostages on a space station. The cadets had to rescue the hostages without getting them killed. It was a simulation, but the academy used real equipment and real consequences for mistakes. Cadets who failed the exercise would have to repeat the course. Jake was assigned to Team 7 with 3 other cadets. His team leader was Brad Collins, who always followed the rules exactly. The other 2 cadets were Mary Webb and Tony Garcia. They were both better students than Jake, but they listened to Brad without question. Jake knew this would be a problem. Commander Vextar stood in the observation deck watching everything. His yellow eyes followed each team as they prepared their equipment. Jake felt those eyes on him and tried not to look up. There was something about the alien commander that made Jake nervous. It was like being watched by a hungry wolf. The space station simulation was built inside a huge training facility. It had multiple levels connected by corridors and maintenance shafts. The hostages were played by academy staff, and the terrorists were holographic projections that could stun cadets with energy weapons. Teams had to move carefully or they would fail. Brad Collins gathered his team and explained the plan. They would use standard breach and clear tactics. 2 cadets would go through the front while 2 others flanked from the side. It was exactly what the textbook said to do. Jake raised his hand to suggest a different approach, but Brad cut him off. They were going to do it the right way. Jake watched the other teams prepare and saw they all had similar plans. Everyone was thinking the same way because that was what they had been taught. But Jake looked at the station layout and saw something different. The artificial gravity generators were spread throughout the structure. If someone could access the control systems, they could create gravity fields that would trap the terrorists without harming the hostages. When Jake tried to explain this idea, Brad told him to be quiet. They were not going to risk their grades on some crazy plan that was not in the manual. Mary and Tony agreed with Brad. Jake was outvoted, so he had to go along with the standard plan even though he knew it would not work well. The exercise began and teams started moving into the station. Jake followed his teammates through the main corridor but kept looking at the maintenance panels on the walls. He could see the gravity control access points that everyone else ignored. The artificial gravity system was designed to be adjusted for different situations, but no one thought to use it as a weapon. Team after team tried the standard approach, and most of them failed. The holographic terrorists were programmed to expect normal tactics, so they knew how to counter them. Some teams managed to rescue a few hostages, but no one achieved a complete success. Brad's team was among the failures. They lost 2 virtual hostages, and 1 team member was stunned by enemy fire. Commander Vextar watched each failure with interest. Jake could see the alien taking notes on a small device. Those yellow eyes missed nothing. Jake wondered what Vextar thought about human military training. The Zephyrians had conquered 17 star systems, so they must know something about fighting that humans did not. After the failed exercise, Jake felt frustrated. He knew there was a better way, but no one would listen. The instructors gave the usual speech about learning from mistakes and following proper procedures. They did not want to hear about alternative solutions that were not in their manuals. That evening, Jake stayed late in the computer lab studying the station schematics. He mapped out the gravity control systems and calculated the power requirements for his idea. The numbers worked, but he would need access to the main control room to make it happen. It was risky and against regulations, but Jake thought it could save all the hostages. Commander Vexitar appeared in the doorway like a shadow. Jake had not heard him approach despite his size. The alien's claws clicked softly as he entered the lab. Jake tried not to show his fear as those yellow eyes studied the computer screen. Vexitar spoke in his grinding voice, asking what Jake was working on. Jake explained his gravity weapon idea, expecting the alien to dismiss it like everyone else. But Vexitar listened carefully and asked questions about the technical details. He seemed genuinely interested in Jake's unconventional thinking. The alien commander said something that surprised Jake. He told him that sometimes the most dangerous enemies were those who did not fight the way they were supposed to. Vextar had seen many battles, and the winners were often those who broke the rules when it mattered. He warned Jake that original thinking was valuable, but also dangerous because it made enemies of those who preferred predictable opponents. As Vextar left the lab, Jake felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. The alien had looked at him like a predator studying interesting prey. Jake wondered if he had just made a powerful enemy, or discovered something important about the nature of war itself. 6 months had passed since graduation, and Jake Morrison now wore the uniform of a junior officer aboard the destroyer USS Defiance. The ship was not the biggest or newest in the fleet, but Captain Lisa Bennett ran it well. Jake served as a tactical analyst, which meant he studied enemy movements and suggested strategies. Most of the time his job was boring, but he preferred it to the academy. The news from the diplomatic corps was getting worse every day. The Zephyrian Empire and human governments were arguing about mining rights in the border systems. What started as simple disagreements had grown into angry accusations. Both sides were moving military ships closer to disputed territories. Everyone could feel that war was coming. Jake studied the Zephyrian military files whenever he had free time. Their ships were bigger and more powerful than human vessels. Their weapons could punch through human shields like they were made of paper. Worse yet, the Zephyrians had been fighting wars for centuries while humans had only been in space for 50 years. If shooting started, the human fleet would be in serious trouble. The attack on New Geneva came without warning. Jake was reviewing supply reports when the emergency alarm started screaming. Captain Bennett's voice echoed through the ship, ordering all hands to battle stations. The communications officer reported that Zephyrian forces had surrounded the colony and were demanding surrender. 3 human ships in the area were trapped and calling for help. Jake ran to the bridge and took his position at the tactical station. The main screen showed the situation, and it looked hopeless. 12 Zephyrian warships had formed a perfect sphere around New Geneva. Their formation was mathematically precise, with overlapping fields of fire that covered every possible escape route. The 3 human ships were caught in the middle like fish in a net. Captain Bennett ordered the Defiance to jump into the system along with 2 other destroyers. That gave the humans 6 ships against 12, but the odds were still terrible. Zephyrian ships were individually more powerful, and their crews had more experience. Jake watched the tactical display and tried to find some advantage that could help even the fight. The Zephyrian fleet was commanded by the same alien Jake had met at the academy. Commander Vextar's ship sat at the center of the formation, directing the others with precise signals. Jake remembered those yellow eyes and wondered if Vextar remembered him too. The alien commander had seemed interested in human tactics back then, but now he was trying to destroy them. Captain Bennett called for suggestions from her officers. The weapons officer wanted to charge straight at the enemy formation. The navigation officer suggested trying to break through at the weakest point. Both plans would probably get them all killed, but no one had better ideas. Jake studied the enemy formation and noticed something that others had missed. The Zephyrian ships were positioned according to mathematical formulas that Jake recognized from academy classes. Their formation was perfect for defending against conventional attacks, but it had one weakness. The aliens were thinking like predators who expected their prey to run in straight lines. They did not account for prey that might change direction in unexpected ways. Jake asked permission to speak, and Captain Bennett nodded. He explained that the enemy formation was based on predictable human behavior. If the human ships acted unpredictably, the Zephyrian formation would have gaps that could be exploited. The key was to use the asteroid field around New Geneva as cover and concealment. Most of the officers looked skeptical. Asteroids were dangerous to navigate and provided little protection against enemy weapons. But Jake had an idea that involved modified mining shuttles and unconventional flight patterns. The plan was risky and violated standard fleet doctrine, but Captain Bennett was desperate enough to listen. Jake suggested using 6 mining shuttles with enhanced shields and targeting systems. The shuttles would approach through the asteroid field using flight paths that seemed random, but were actually calculated to confuse Zephyrian sensors. While the enemy tracked the shuttles, the human warships would position themselves for surprise attacks on weakened targets. The mining shuttles were not military vessels and had minimal weapons, but they were designed to work in dangerous environments and could maneuver in ways that confused military targeting systems. Jake volunteered to lead the shuttle group since the plan was his idea. Captain Bennett was reluctant to risk a junior officer, but Jake insisted that he understood the tactic better than anyone else. The shuttle pilots were volunteers from the mining ships at New Geneva. They knew how to fly in asteroid fields and were angry about the Zephyrian attack. Jake explained the flight patterns they would need to use. The routes looked random but followed mathematical principles that would create maximum confusion for enemy sensors. Calibrated to track military vessels, Jake's shuttle group launched from the Defiance and immediately disappeared into the asteroid field. The Zephyrian formation shifted slightly to track the new contacts but maintained their overall pattern. Vextar was too experienced to abandon his defensive position for such a small threat. Jake counted on that predictable response. The asteroids provided perfect cover for the unorthodox approach. Jake led his group through gaps that larger ships could not use. The Zephyrian sensors kept losing contact as the shuttles disappeared behind rocky obstacles. The aliens tried to predict where the shuttles would emerge, but Jake's flight patterns defied their calculations. While the enemy focused on tracking the elusive shuttles, Captain Bennett moved the human warships into attack positions. The Zephyrian formation was designed to defend against frontal assaults, not flanking maneuvers by ships using asteroid cover. Bennett timed her attack perfectly to coincide with Jake's emergence from the asteroid field. Jake's shuttles appeared at the worst possible moment for the Zephyrians. Their sensors were confused by multiple small contacts moving in impossible patterns. The shuttles targeted shield generators on 2 enemy cruisers with concentrated mining laser fire. The weapons were not designed for combat, but they could cut through military hardware when properly focused. The human destroyers opened fire just as the Zephyrian shields failed. Plasma torpedoes that should have been deflected instead punched through enemy armor. 2 alien cruisers suffered critical damage and fell out of formation. The perfect mathematical sphere collapsed into chaos as remaining ships tried to respond to threats from multiple directions. Commander, Vextar's flagship attempted to restore order, but the surprise was complete. Jake's shuttles had already disappeared back into the asteroid field, while the human warships pressed their advantage. For the first time in the war, human forces achieved a tactical victory against superior numbers. 3 Zephyrian ships were destroyed, and 4 others damaged badly enough to retreat. The remaining enemy vessels withdrew from New Geneva carrying word of defeat back to their empire. Jake's shuttles returned to the Defiance with no losses and minimal damage. The mining ship crews were heroes, and Jake found himself promoted to lieutenant commander for tactical innovation. Under fire. Captain Bennett called Jake to her ready room after the battle. She wanted to understand how he had developed such an effective strategy against overwhelming odds. Jake explained that he had studied Zephyrian formations and found them too perfect. Perfect formations assumed perfect opponents who would respond in predictable ways. The captain asked if Jake thought the same tactics would work again. Jake shook his head and said probably not. Vextar was too smart to fall for the same trick twice. The alien commander would adapt his strategies based on this defeat. Next time the Zephyrians would be ready for unconventional human tactics. Jake was right about Vextar adapting. Intelligence reports soon indicated that Zephyrian forces were changing their formation patterns and sensor configurations. The alien commander had learned from his defeat and was preparing countermeasures. Jake realized that he had not just won a battle but started a deadly game of tactical evolution. The victory at New Geneva gave human forces hope that they could fight the Zephyrian Empire on equal terms. But Jake knew the truth was more complicated. He had surprised a superior enemy once, but surprises only worked when the opponent was not expecting them. Vextar would be watching for Jake Morrison now, and that made everything more dangerous. News of the battle spread throughout human space, and Jake became famous as the officer who had outmaneuvered the legendary Zephyrian commander. But fame was a double-edged weapon that made Jake a target for enemy attention. He wondered if beating Vextar once had been worth the cost of making such a dangerous enemy focus on him personally. Commander Vextar stood before the Zephyrian High Command and accepted his shame with dignity. The defeat at New Geneva had cost the Empire 3 warships and damaged 4 others. Worse than the material losses was the blow to Zephyrian prestige. No human force had ever achieved tactical victory against superior Zephyrian numbers until Jake Morrison appeared. The high command chambers were built to intimidate with dark stone walls, and the skulls of conquered enemies mounted as trophies. 12 ancient warriors sat in judgment wearing the ceremonial armor of their clans. Their yellow eyes glowed in the dim light as they pronounced Vextar's punishment. He would be demoted from fleet commander to ship captain, but given one chance to redeem his honor. The mission was simple in concept, but difficult in execution. Vextar must hunt down and eliminate the human tactical genius who had humiliated the Empire. Intelligence reports identified Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison as the architect of the New Geneva victory and several subsequent human successes. The young human had become a symbol of resistance that inspired other human forces to fight harder. Vextar accepted the assignment knowing that failure would mean exile or death. His warrior culture did not forgive repeated defeats, and the High Command was already questioning his competence. The alien commander had built his reputation on centuries of successful campaigns, but one human had shattered that legacy in a single battle. Back aboard his flagship, the Crimson Talon, Vextar began studying everything known about Jake Morrison. The human came from a farming colony, where resources were scarce and creativity was essential for survival. His academy records showed average grades but occasional flashes of brilliance that confused his instructors. Most telling were the comments about his unwillingness to follow standard procedures. The recordings of the New Geneva battle played endlessly on Vextar's screen. He watched Jake's shuttle group navigate the asteroid field using flight patterns that seemed random, but clearly followed some underlying logic. The human had turned mining vessels into weapons and used mathematical formations against themselves. It was brilliant and infuriating at the same time. Vextar realized that defeating Jake Morrison would require understanding how the human mind worked under pressure. Zephyrian military doctrine emphasized overwhelming force and predictable tactics that had proven successful against dozens of species. But humans seemed to thrive on unpredictability and turn disadvantages into advantages through sheer creativity. The alien commander began studying Earth's military history going back thousands of years. Human warfare was chaotic and brutal, with constant innovation driven by desperation. Unlike Zephyrian conflicts that followed ancient honor codes, human wars were about survival at any cost. That desperation bred tactical creativity that conventional military minds could not predict or counter. Jake Morrison's subsequent victories followed the same pattern established at New Geneva. He would study enemy formations until he found weaknesses that others missed. Then he would exploit those weaknesses using unconventional methods that confused enemy commanders. His success rate was extraordinary, but each victory made him more famous and therefore more dangerous to Zephyrian morale. Admiral Roy Patterson had recognized Jake's potential and given him command of a special operations unit. The team consisted of hand-picked officers who shared Jake's willingness to break rules when necessary. They operated independently of Fleet Command and reported directly to Patterson, who protected them from bureaucratic interference. Vextar learned about Jake's team through captured intelligence reports. Pilot Amy Cooper was known for impossible maneuvers that defied safety regulations. Engineer Dan Foster could modify any equipment to serve purposes never intended by its designers. Marine Sergeant Kate Williams led boarding actions that succeeded despite overwhelming odds. Together, they formed a unit that thought outside normal military parameters. The alien commander spent weeks developing psychological profiles of each team member. He studied their backgrounds and tactical preferences, looking for patterns that might be exploited. Amy Cooper was reckless but brilliant with natural instincts for three-dimensional combat. Dan Foster was methodical but willing to take calculated risks with experimental technology. Kate Williams was aggressive but protective of her troops. Understanding Jake Morrison himself proved more difficult. The humans' tactical decisions seemed to follow no consistent pattern, except that they always surprised his opponents. Vextar began to suspect that unpredictability itself was Jake's primary weapon. By refusing to develop consistent patterns, Jake made himself almost impossible to predict or counter. Zephyrian intelligence networks throughout human space reported Jake's movements and activities. His Special Operations Unit had struck Zephyrian supply lines, communication centers, and isolated outposts. Each attack followed different methods and targeted different weaknesses. The only constant was that Jake always found ways to achieve objectives despite being outnumbered and outgunned. Vextar noticed that Jake's operations followed a subtle pattern that became visible only when viewed over months rather than individual battles. The human was not just winning tactical victories, but systematically disrupting Zephyrian strategic planning. Supply disruptions forced changes in deployment schedules. Communication losses created coordination problems between fleet elements. Outpost attacks made commanders nervous about leaving positions undefended. The cumulative effect was that Zephyrian forces were becoming more cautious and predictable. Commanders who feared surprise attacks would concentrate their forces and follow defensive doctrines. That gave Jake's unit more opportunities to exploit standard responses and achieve surprise in future operations. The human was not just fighting battles but shaping the entire strategic environment. Vextar realized that conventional hunting tactics would not work against such an opponent. Jake Morrison was not a typical military target who could be cornered through superior force. The human thrived in impossible situations and turned traps into opportunities. Any attempt to corner him directly would probably result in another humiliating defeat for Zephyrian forces. The alien commander began developing a different approach, based on his growing understanding of human psychology. Instead of trying to overpower Jake, he would attempt to outthink him. Vextar would create situations where conventional tactics failed, and unconventional responses led to predetermined consequences. It would be a trap disguised as an opportunity. The plan required extensive preparation and perfect timing. Vextar would need to manipulate information networks to make Jake believe he had found a valuable target. The bait would have to be irresistible but not obviously suspicious. Most importantly, the trap would need to account for Jake's tendency to find unexpected solutions to impossible problems. Vextar spent days studying the abandoned mining station Omega-7 in the Kepler system. The facility had been evacuated when the war started, but still contained valuable equipment and data storage systems. More importantly, its location made it seem like an easy target for a quick strike mission. Intelligence reports could be manipulated to suggest the station held critical information about Zephyrian fleet movements. The alien commander mapped every corridor and access point in the station. He calculated power requirements for all systems and identified potential weapons that creative minds might devise from industrial equipment. The fusion reactor had been shut down safely, but residual energy remained in various subsystems that could theoretically be accessed by skilled engineers. Most importantly, Vextar studied the station's communication arrays and sensor networks. These systems could be modified to serve as jamming devices that would prevent outside contact during his operation. But the same modifications might also interfere with other station systems in ways that clever humans could exploit. It was a calculated risk that made the trap more believable. The psychological profile of Jake Morrison suggested he would be attracted to missions that seemed impossible but offered strategic value. Omega-7 could be presented as containing intelligence that would give human forces a major advantage in future battles. Jake's protective instincts toward human civilians would also be triggered by reports of Zephyrian experiments on captured colonists. Vextar knew that Jake would see through any trap that was too obvious or too simple. The human had survived this long by being suspicious of easy opportunities. But Jake also had a weakness for protecting innocent people and gaining strategic advantages for his outnumbered forces. Those motivations could be used to overcome his natural caution. The alien commander finalized his plans and began positioning assets throughout the Kepler system. Multiple Zephyrian ships would remain hidden until the trap was sprung. Sensor jammers would prevent escape while overwhelming firepower would crush any resistance. This time Vextar would account for every possible human response, including Jake's talent for turning desperate situations into tactical advantages. The intelligence briefing seemed almost too good to be true, but Jake Morrison had learned to trust his instincts about valuable targets. The abandoned mining station Omega-7 supposedly contained critical data about Zephyrian fleet movements and experimental weapons research. Even better, the station appeared to be lightly defended with only automated systems and possibly a small garrison. Admiral Patterson had personally approved the mission, which gave Jake confidence that the intelligence was reliable. His special operations team would infiltrate the station, download the data, and escape before enemy reinforcements could arrive. It was exactly the kind of quick strike operation that had made Jake's unit famous throughout the human fleet. Amy Cooper studied the navigation charts for the Kepler system and found several approach routes that would avoid Zephyrian patrol patterns. Her modifications to their scout ship Nightfall had improved its stealth capabilities beyond standard specifications. Dan Foster had equipped the vessel with experimental jamming devices that could confuse enemy sensors during their approach and escape. Kate Williams reviewed the station layout and planned entry routes for her Marine team. The facility was designed for industrial operations, not military defense, so there were multiple access points that could be exploited. Her troops carried specialized equipment for cutting through bulkheads and bypassing security systems without triggering alarms. Jake felt uneasy about the mission, despite its apparent advantages. Something about the timing seemed suspicious, with the intelligence arriving just when human forces needed a strategic breakthrough. But the potential intelligence value was too important to ignore, and his team was experienced enough to handle unexpected complications. The journey to Omega-7 took 3 days through hyperspace, followed by careful sublight approach to avoid detection. Amy's piloting skills kept them hidden from Zephyrian sensors, while Dan's jamming devices masked their electronic signature. The mining station appeared exactly as described in the intelligence reports, with no obvious signs of enemy activity. Jake ordered a full scan of the station before committing to the mission. The results showed minimal power signatures consistent with automated systems maintaining basic life support. There were no energy readings that suggested active weapons or communication arrays. Most importantly, there were no biosigns indicating the presence of living defenders. The team docked with the station through a cargo bay that showed signs of hasty evacuation. Personal belongings were scattered throughout the area, and some equipment had been abandoned in working condition. Kate's Marines secured the immediate area while Dan began accessing the station's computer networks to locate the intelligence files. Jake felt the uneasiness growing stronger as they moved deeper into the facility. Everything was too perfect, with exactly the right amount of detail to seem authentic, but not enough complications to suggest real danger. His experience had taught him that truly valuable targets were never this easy to reach. The station's main computer core was located in the central hub, surrounded by multiple levels of offices and laboratories. Dan's preliminary scans indicated that most data files were intact and could be downloaded quickly. The fusion reactor had been properly shut down, but backup power systems were maintaining environmental controls. Throughout the facility, Kate's team spread out to secure the perimeter, while Amy remained with the ship ready for immediate departure. Jake and Dan proceeded to the computer core, where they began the delicate process of accessing encrypted Zephyrian files. The security systems were sophisticated, but not beyond Dan's considerable skills with alien technology. The first files that Dan managed to decrypt seemed to confirm the intelligence reports. There were detailed fleet movement schedules and weapon specifications that would give human forces significant advantages in future engagements. Jake reviewed the data and felt his uneasiness transform into certainty that something was very wrong. The intelligence was too complete and too convenient. Real military documents would have gaps and inconsistencies that reflected the chaos of ongoing operations. These files read like textbook examples of everything human intelligence analysts hope to find. Jake realized they had walked into an elaborate trap. Before Jake could warn his team, the station's communication arrays suddenly activated with jamming signals that blocked all outside contact. Emergency lighting bathed the corridors in red as automated security systems began sealing blast doors throughout the facility. Kate's voice crackled over the intercom, reporting that escape routes were being systematically blocked. Dan frantically tried to override the security lockdown, but found that his access codes had been revoked. The station's computer systems were following pre-programmed instructions that anticipated every countermeasure his equipment could deploy. Someone had studied human hacking techniques carefully and prepared specific defenses. Jake ordered his team to converge on the computer core, where they might be able to coordinate a defense. Amy reported that Zephyrian ships were decloaking throughout the system in a perfect formation that blocked every possible escape route. The trap had been sprung with mathematical precision that left no room for error. Commander Vextar's voice echoed through the station's communication system, offering terms for surrender. The alien commander had planned everything perfectly, accounting for human tactics and psychology. He had studied Jake's methods and prepared countermeasures for every possible response, including the unconventional thinking that had made Jake famous. Kate's Marines reached the computer core and established defensive positions, but their situation was hopeless. The Zephyrian boarding parties would have overwhelming numbers and superior equipment. Standard military doctrine offered no solutions for escaping from such a perfectly designed trap. Jake studied the station schematics on Dan's portable computer, looking for any detail that Vextar might have overlooked. The alien commander was brilliant and thorough, but he was also thinking like a predator who expected his prey to follow predictable patterns. Jake needed to find something that no reasonable person would consider using as a weapon. The fusion reactor had been shut down properly, but the magnetic containment system still held residual energy. Jake realized that Dan's jamming devices operated on frequencies that might interfere with magnetic field stability if they were overloaded deliberately. It was an insane idea that would probably kill them all, but it was the only option that Vextar would not have anticipated. Dan looked horrified when Jake explained the plan, but quickly began calculating the technical requirements. They would need to access the reactor control room and manually override the safety systems. Then they would overload the communication jammers to create magnetic field fluctuations that could destabilize the containment bottle in a controlled manner. The explosion would cripple every ship in the system, including their own vessel, but the mining station had emergency pods designed to survive reactor accidents. If they could reach the pods before the explosion and shield them properly, they might survive while the Zephyrian fleet was destroyed. It was suicide unless everything went perfectly. Kate's Marines would have to hold the computer core while Jake and Dan reached the reactor control room. Amy would need to bring the Nightfall closer to the station despite enemy fire, so they could transfer to the emergency pods. The timing would have to be perfect with no margin for error. Zephyrian boarding parties were already cutting through the outer blast doors when Jake's team began implementing their desperate plan. Dan accessed the reactor controls while Jake calculated the precise overload sequence needed to create a fusion explosion without destroying the emergency pods. Kate's Marines fought a running battle through the corridors, buying precious time. The magnetic containment fields began fluctuating as Dan overloaded the jamming devices. Jake watched the reactor readings climb toward critical levels, while emergency alarms screamed throughout the station. In a few minutes, the fusion bottle would collapse and release enough energy to vaporize everything within 1,000 kilometers. Amy brought the Nightfall in close despite heavy fire from Zephyrian ships that were trying to prevent any escape. Her modified engines could barely maintain position against the gravitational effects of the destabilizing reactor. Jake's team had less than 2 minutes to reach the emergency pods before the explosion. The plan was working, but Jake realized that Vextar would not be fooled for long. The alien commander was too intelligent to be completely surprised by unconventional tactics. He would recognize the reactor overload and try to escape before the explosion. Jake needed to ensure that the trap he had turned against its creator could not be avoided. The fusion explosion lit up the Kepler system like a second sun, as Jake Morrison's desperate gamble paid off in ways that exceeded his wildest hopes. The carefully planned overload had created a controlled nuclear detonation that crippled every Zephyrian ship within 1,000 kilometers. Commander Vexistar's perfect trap had become a prison for his own forces when the prey proved more dangerous than the predator. Jake's team had barely reached the emergency pods when the reactor exploded. The specially shielded mining pods were designed to protect workers during industrial accidents, but they had never been tested against deliberate fusion detonations. Amy Cooper's piloting skills kept their pod stable, while Kate Williams coordinated the evacuation of her Marines from the doomed station. Dan Foster's calculations had been perfect. The magnetic field collapse had released exactly enough energy to disable the Zephyrian fleet without completely destroying the mining station. The emergency pod survived the explosion and began broadcasting distress signals that would bring human rescue ships within hours. Jake's impossible plan had worked, but the cost had been enormous. The Zephyrian ships were crippled but not destroyed. Their hulls were damaged and their weapon systems were offline, but life support was still functioning. Jake watched through the pod's small viewport as alien vessels drifted helplessly through space. Some ships were venting atmosphere while others showed signs of internal fires. The proud Zephyrian fleet had been reduced to floating wreckage. Commander Vextar's flagship Crimson Talon was among the most damaged vessels. The massive warship had been closest to the station when the reactor exploded and had taken the full force of the electromagnetic pulse. Its engines were dead and its communication arrays were destroyed. The ship that had terrorized human colonies was now as helpless as the miners it had hunted. Jake made a decision that surprised his own team. Instead of waiting for rescue, he ordered their emergency pod to intercept Vextar's damaged flagship. Amy protested that it was too dangerous, but Jake insisted they needed to capture the alien commander before he could escape. Kate prepared her Marines for a boarding action, while Dan worked on cutting through the enemy ship's hull. The Crimson Talon's defenses were completely offline when Jake's pod docked with the crippled vessel. Emergency lighting flickered through corridors filled with smoke and debris. Zephyrian crew members were struggling to repair critical systems, but they offered no resistance to the human boarding party. They seemed more concerned with survival than fighting. Jake found Commander Vextar on the bridge surrounded by damaged equipment and injured officers. The alien commander was working frantically to restore communication with his scattered fleet. His yellow eyes showed a mixture of rage and desperate determination as he tried to salvage something from the disaster. When Vextar saw Jake enter the bridge's expression changed to something that humans rarely saw in Zephyrian faces. It was not anger or hatred, but a deep recognition of defeat by a superior opponent. The predator who had hunted Jake across the galaxy now understood what it felt like to be prey caught in an inescapable trap. Jake studied the alien who had once seemed so terrifying at the Naval Academy. Vextar was still physically imposing with his scaled armor and razor claws, but his predatory confidence was gone. The commander who had conquered 17 star systems now faced the reality that he had been outmaneuvered by someone he had underestimated. Theo, Alien's voice was barely a whisper when he spoke, asking how Jake had known about the trap. Jake explained that the intelligence had been too perfect and the timing too convenient. Real military secrets were never so easily obtained and valuable targets were never so lightly defended. Vextar had made his trap too obvious in his eagerness to catch his prey. Vextar nodded slowly, understanding his mistake. He had studied human psychology but failed to appreciate that Jake Morrison was not a typical human officer. The alien had prepared for conventional responses to desperate situations, but had not anticipated that his prey might turn the entire station into a weapon. Jake looked around the damaged bridge and saw Zephyrian officers, watching their exchange with fearful eyes. These aliens had followed their commander into battle expecting easy victory over inferior human forces. Now they were stranded in space dependent on human mercy for their survival. The reversal of fortune was complete. Commander Vextar struggled to his feet despite obvious injuries and faced Jake with whatever dignity remained to him. The alien warrior's pride demanded that he accept responsibility for his failure and the fate of his crew. In his grinding voice, he asked what terms Jake would offer for their surrender. The question surprised Jake because he had not thought beyond rescuing his own team. Standard military doctrine called for taking prisoners and gathering intelligence, but the situation was far from standard. Jake held the lives of hundreds of Zephyrian warriors in his hands, including the commander who had become his personal nemesis, Kate. Williams suggested that they should interrogate the prisoners for information about enemy fleet movements. Dan Foster wanted to study Zephyrian technology to improve human defenses. Amy Cooper pointed out that rescue ships would arrive soon and decisions needed to be made quickly about what to do. With so many enemy prisoners, Jake made his choice based on something he had learned about Zephyrian culture during his research. Honor was more important to these aliens than life itself, and Commander Vextar had accepted defeat with dignity. The alien commander had shown mercy to Jake's team by offering surrender terms instead of fighting to the death. Jake decided to return that courtesy. Speaking directly to Vextar, Jake offered terms that would preserve the alien commander's honor, while ensuring the safety of human forces. The Zephyrian prisoners would be treated according to galactic conventions for captured military personnel. In exchange, Vextar would provide intelligence about enemy fleet dispositions and future military plans. The alien commander considered the offer carefully before accepting. He understood that Jake was offering him a chance to protect his crew while maintaining some dignity in defeat. It was more generous than Vextar would have offered if their positions had been reversed, and he recognized the gesture as a sign of superior character. As human rescue ships arrived, Jake found himself face to face with the alien who had hunted him across the galaxy. Commander Vexistar looked at him with new understanding and said something that would stay with Jake forever. The alien told him that predators eventually learned they could become prey, but few prey ever learned to become something more dangerous than either. Jake realized that Vextar was acknowledging not just military defeat but a fundamental shift in the balance of power between their species. The Zephyrian Empire had conquered dozens of worlds by relying on superior strength and conventional tactics. But humans fought differently because they had never been apex predators on their own world. The war would continue, but everything had changed. Zephyrian commanders would no longer assume easy victory over human forces. They had learned that humans could turn any situation into a weapon and any trap into an opportunity. The prey species had proven they were more dangerous than the predators who hunted them. Admiral Patterson arrived aboard the rescue fleet and debriefed Jake personally about the mission. The intelligence gathered from Vextar would give human forces strategic advantages for months to come. More importantly, the psychological impact of the victory would inspire human troops throughout the galaxy to fight harder against overwhelming odds. Jake received another promotion in command of an expanded special operations division, but he took no satisfaction in his success. The war was far from over, and the Zephyrian Empire would adapt to counter-human tactics. Future battles would be even more dangerous as both sides escalated their methods. In the struggle for survival, Commander Vextar was transported to a secure facility where he would spend the remainder of the war as a prisoner. Before leaving, he asked to speak with Jake one final time. The alien commander wanted to understand what made humans so difficult to defeat. Despite their obvious physical disadvantages, Jake explained that humans had evolved as persistence hunters who succeeded through endurance and intelligence rather than strength. They had never been the strongest or fastest species on Earth, so they learned to survive by being smarter and more adaptable. When faced with impossible odds, humans did not give up, but instead found new ways to fight. The alien commander listened carefully and said he finally understood why the Zephyrian Empire would ultimately lose the war. Predators relied on established methods that had worked in the past, but humans constantly evolved new tactics based on changing circumstances. In a conflict between adaptation and tradition, adaptation would always win eventually. As Vextar was led away, he looked back at Jake with something approaching respect. The predator had learned what it meant to become prey, but more importantly, he had recognized that his former victim had become something far more dangerous than either predator or prey. Jake Morrison had become the embodiment of human potential unleashed against an enemy that did not understand what they were really fighting.